I am well, Ryan. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. We're going to talk a lot about case studies. And as you could see from the title, and obviously something about the title struck your fancy, talking about the use of case studies as a pedagogical tool for teaching communication courses. I am going to stop my PowerPoint share for a moment because I do want to talk for the next few minutes just about really what got me engaged in this whole thing that we call the case study approach. And I would like to start with a brief story. Um, on the day before the midterm, Professor Jefferson reminds her introduction to physics class that the exam will take place tomorrow. She reminds her students that the exam will cover relativity, magnetism, electromagnetic waves, electric forces, circuitry, refraction, and wave optics. She lets them know that the exam will be a total of 32 questions in length, 12 multiple choice, 10 short answer, 8 true false, and 2 longer essay questions. She recommends that her students really study the contributions made by David Brewster, Willibrord Snell, Lev Landau, Otto Stern, Owen Richardson, Niels Bohr, and Charles Barkla, and such key things as the Doppler effect, atomic theory, the exclusion principle, fundamental symmetry, the hydrogen bubble chamber, X-ray diffraction, and vapor condensation. She tells them that they are allowed to bring in one index card, 3x5, with any information that they wish as a helpful guide, but encourages them to be wary about doing this because they will only have 80 minutes to complete the exam. And searching for information on this card for the answer might be a little bit troublesome and time consuming. So she warns them about this. Finally, Professor Jefferson reminds her students that this exam will account for 30% of their final grade. She then asks the entire class if anyone has any questions. After much hesitation and nearly 10 seconds of pure silence, a student from the back of the room with clear nonverbal reluctance stands up and says, "I'm sorry, Professor, when is the exam?" I think that this story illustrates 3 major things about today's college student. First, that people pick up on different things. Second, that people assign levels of importance in different ways. And third, that our brains cognitively process things at different moments, with different speeds, at different levels, and with different effects. Collectively, this all has hugely important implications for how we teach our students. I'm currently employed at a teaching institution, and I have attended many conferences about pedagogical best practices. I've been involved in many GIFTS panels over the years at conferences, and GIFTS is the acronym for Great Ideas for Teaching Students. What have I learned? I have learned that my ways of learning 20 years ago and today's ways of learning are strikingly different. How did I learn? I learned from lecture. As an undergraduate student at the University of Delaware, I would take notes in class. I would then read the assigned chapters at home. I would try to make sense of the connection between the two. I would write a few papers. I would take a few exams. I would make a few public presentations, and I would earn a final grade. And I did okay. Believe it or not, the 2 most difficult courses that I took, and those with which I struggled the most, were called the History of Chocolate Through Literature and the History of Rock and Roll. So much for making assumptions based on course titles. I loved my college experience, which is why I chose this as a profession. But it was not because of the teaching methods. It was because of the classes and the materials and the instructors. By and large, we as students learn the same way. But it was not until my junior year when I took Business 301, which was Introduction to Marketing, when I was first exposed to a case study dealing with the trials and tribulations with the 1985 New Coke fiasco, which was among the many case studies within Larson's 1997 text entitled Cases in Marketing. In fact, if you know about the genesis of the case study as a pedagogical tool, you likely know that the 2 fields in which the case study approach really began were business and law. But my professor, the late great Victor Giardini, knew that to teach about segmentation, targeting, and positioning, it was best to show through example. It was not until 5 years later at Rutgers University as a graduate student that I was exposed to another series of cases, this time about organizational communication. I learned about conflict management and leadership, and employee assistance programs and teams, and technology and politics and gossip networks and sexual harassment. But I didn't learn about this through lecture. I learned about it through the case study approach. How do Gen Z learners learn? I like to make the argument that Gen Z learners really desire and need and want and thrive from 7 things in terms of their education. And we're going to speak about a lot of these over the next 25, 30 minutes. They want to be active learners. They don't want to engage in critical, creative thinking. They want application of material. They want a cogent answer to the why will I need this and how will I use this question. I do not like the phrase real world, but case studies become the pedagogical tools that bridge the chasm between the theoretical and the applied. They want to learn by engagement. They want to experience the flipped classroom where they become the instructor and the instructor becomes the learner. And they want to be able to apply and engage in analytical skills. The last 7 to 10 minutes, at least I hope, has paved the way for the need to incorporate the case study into our classroom environments. And it is here that I would like to really introduce the meat of our discussion. Ryan, can you just kindly confirm that you can see this?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay. So, who am I? As Ryan had introduced, my name is Corey Lieberman. I grew up in New Jersey. I left for the University of Delaware in 1997, from which I graduated in 2001. I took a year off to work in marketing to earn a little bit of extra money, even though I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. Since the fall of 2008, I have been teaching at a very small liberal arts college on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. We have about 1,800 students, 490 of which are enrolled in our communication and media arts programs, and I love my job. I also obviously love the use of emojis. My students really bust my chops about that often. I was married in 2007 to my wonderful wife, Sarah. We have 2 children, one of whom is 12. Her name is Haley, and my son, Bradley, who is 8. I love to play golf and tennis. I love to coach my kids in their sports, softball, baseball, and now soccer. My weekend, actually, we have 4 soccer games, and depending on if they extend into further rounds of their tournament, it depends what Sunday looks like. And my son also has 3 basketball games. Love sports. I love fantasy football. I am not very good at it, but I love engaging in it. And my 2 favorite foods happen to be lamb and sushi. But the question becomes why I just spent the last 90 seconds speaking to you about who I am, about identity. Why is it that, as the title of a great edited book from 2002, in fact, one of my advisors at Rutgers, his book Identity Matters. Why is it that identity matters? The social construction of self, and how self is produced by communication, but is also a result of our communication. Well, because our collective field of inquiry has practical implications, and because what we teach matters. And my argument for the next 10, 15 minutes is going to be, and this is really why I've become so involved in the study and practice and research about and the publishing about case studies has become really part and parcel of my entire academic life, is that what we teach and how we teach it extends so far beyond the classroom and so far beyond the textbook and so far beyond the notebook, that we really need to reconsider our pedagogical approach to whatever course it is that we teach. I teach a course in interpersonal communication at the 100 level class. at the 100 level. And the first class after going over the syllabus, I oftentimes ask that rhetorical questions. Why do relationships matter? And what is the relationship between communication and relationships? How A creates B, but B then creates A, right? It's communication that produces relationships, but it's then the nature of the relationship that produces communicative outcomes. Well, communication has important implications for how this happens. I teach a course in group communication, and after going over that syllabus, and this is at the 300 level, and I still engage them in this seemingly rhetorical question, why is it that groups matter? Well, when we think about getting into groups, whether it's for effective decision making, whether it's for emergent or contrived leadership, whether it's for argumentation, it's all about communication. And yeah, we could read books about it. We can read the scholarship about it. But having them engage in this through vis-a-vis the case study approach makes the difference. And we are going to talk about the 5 best practices of engaging our students in such a pedagogical approach. I teach a 200 level course in organizational communication, and very much like identity matters and groups matter, well, organizations matter as well. And I tell them, let's think about organizations. You are going to graduate, and in all likelihood, you are going to spend the greater part of your lives in organizations. The average person is not going to retire until they are about 71. That's what Harvard Business Review argues today. So let us assume that we are working for somewhere around 50 years post-graduation. Let's think about the average day in the average life of an individual. They are going to be sleeping for roughly 8 hours of their day. They are probably going to be at work for roughly 8 hours of their day. And they're hopefully going to be doing something for enjoyment for the other 8 hours of their day. 8 hours of a day is mathematically and statistically 1/3 of their day, 1/3 of their life. If we do the statistical analysis of 1/3 of 50 years, that's a heck of a lot of time that we are spending in our organization. I was talking to Ryan earlier about my commute from New Jersey to New York City, which is 90 minutes. I take a car to a parking deck. I go from a parking deck to a bus stop. I take a bus to Port Authority. I take a train to a train stop, and I walk 3 blocks to my office. If I didn't love my job and the people with whom I work, I would be in a fit of disaster. But the fact of the matter is that effective communication matters. We are more satisfied, we are more committed, we are more motivated because of the interaction and communication between and among key stakeholders. When it comes to things like dissent practices, when it comes to things like, again, decision making, when it comes to things like the social construction of power. Now, yeah, we can stand up in front of a classroom and talk about these things, but how about we actually do power? How about we do decisions? And that's what the case study allows us to do. And then I teach a 300 level class in persuasion. Persuasion is something that we do all of the time. Persuasion matters. And if we go back to Berlow's original definition of communication, where a source sent a message through a channel to a recipient with some desired effect, this is what happens all of the time from a persuasive perspective. And it's a constant battle among these independent variables. And yes, there are certain strategies that are more or less effective. And it's all about the creation, the solidification, and the change of attitude. And attitude, as I tell my students, is the #1 predictor of behavior. Why do we do what we do? Well, it's because we think it's a good idea. And again, we can get up in front of the classroom and we could teach about this. But students then want to say, well, let's talk about examples of this. Well, I, on Saturday night, tried to persuade my friends to go to this particular restaurant or not to go to this particular party, or for my friend not to wear this particular outfit, which is great. That's the internal dialogue that's happening within that flipped classroom. But what about those assignments that happen outside of the classroom? There is no better pedagogical approach than the use of a case study. What's the problem? The problem is that sometimes students leave a course saying, I don't understand the connection here. And yes, it can be argued that some of our theories are not amazingly difficult to understand at face value. Once we read them deeper and really start to apply them, it's then that we say to ourselves, wow, it's not that it's so difficult or not difficult, but it's all about how it is that we now apply this. And the application is what is key, part and parcel of the course material to the case that we are going to assign, which we are going to talk about momentarily. And students oftentimes also say, I just don't understand, and this is different between real world and real life. The real life application, how do I actually apply the theory of sense making or social penetration theory? The opportunity, well, we have the case study approach. I love to bust the chops of my mathematics colleagues who it's much more difficult to apply a case study approach. I saw this meme several years ago. I'm so glad I learned about parallelograms instead of how to do taxes. It's really come in handy this parallelogram season. What are the implications of this? It's that, look, what is the goal of learning about parallelograms? How am I now going to use this? What is knowledge about mathematics other than being able to do my taxes and other than being able to engage in financial decisions? How now is mathematics going to be able to become some sort of a forthcoming future advantage for me? And while I think it's much more difficult in the mathematical sciences, I certainly do not think that is the case in the social sciences, especially in the world of communication. I want to argue here, and then I would love to open this up for discussion. I think, and this is based on the last 14 years of using and embedding the case study approach into my courses. And it doesn't matter whether I am teaching interpersonal communication or group communication. It doesn't matter if I am teaching persuasive communication or social network theory. It doesn't matter if I am teaching communication theory. I really want to argue that there are 5 best practices that collectively we could incorporate into our courses. The first, I like to say, let's make it an active learning experience for students, which if you recall, this is one of the things that I really think based on what I read in the literature, what I have learned from conferencing, is a huge difference between today's Gen Z learner and yesteryear's millennial learner. Students who are more involved in the learning process are more likely to get something out of the said course. There are data that indicate that 18.8% increase in student learning outcomes. Now, there is a problem with this percentage. In fact, there are 2 problems. The first is that in order to gain data about this, we would have to be running 2 courses concomitantly. One that is incorporating the case study and one that is not. And the second is that we really have no benchmark here. We have no way of really knowing, at least from what I have heard, where do we want our students to be? Benchmarks would argue that maybe we don't want everybody from a realistic perspective. We are not expecting everybody to exceed the learning outcomes that we are putting out there. But if we have an 18.8% increase, this is probably bringing student grades up at least a letter, if not a letter and a half. Over the summer, I teach a marketing course. And if I engage students in a new product or a product that has existed where an organization has made some changes to it, let's assume, and I'm only giving this because I have my Diet Pepsi bottle right next to me. Let's assume that Diet Pepsi does something to its labeling and it increases sales the next 18 months by 1.2%. I then ask 1.2%, how many of you would like to earn a 1.2% on your next exam? Nobody raises their hand. But I then say 1.2% increase of the already existing consumers equates to over $1 million in sales increase. They then start to rethink what 1.8% really means. 18.8% increase just by incorporating the case study approach and its increase in involvement is absolutely huge. And active learning becomes more of a possibility through the incorporation of the case study approach. Best practice number 2 is to have students conceive of different outcomes. I have never, ever read a case study where there are not questions at the end, and these questions are open-ended, where there is not an objective response. An objective response is there is absolutely a right and a wrong answer. It is how it is that you provide evidentiary support to really make your claim be known and to support it. Well, the fact of the matter is, even within the same group, if you are going to engage in group case study assignments, you can have students engage in maybe debate about how it is that a persuasive campaign ought to have been conceived of differently, or how a relational breakup may have been achieved differently, or how it is that a group situation where we had leaders trying to mend a conflict, how and why it was not the appropriate strategy. Have them figure out why it is that option A may have been different than option B, which is different than option C, but all of the three being rational options from a communicative perspective. Again, communication being the independent variable linked to the dependent variable of effectiveness, regardless of what the particular nature of that case study is. And what's great that I have found is that this then provides for so much post-case dialogue. And this dialogue then happens either in the classroom, which for those of us that know what a flipped classroom is, that's what's happening in the classroom, or it's happening outside the classroom that then provides the forum for the next class to engage in such discussion. Best practice number 3, and I think that this is hugely important because I have seen the case study approach gone wrong also many a time, is that it is so important that we require students to link the case study to the course material. And in fact, when I give my students questions, I say, please be sure to link your answers back to specific things about which we have spoken in class and about which you have read in the textbook. We now have a triadic approach. They're learning things in class, they are reading things in the book, and they are now discussing and thinking about things that they read in the case study. If we go back to the 7 ways that today's Gen Z population learns, I think that it accomplishes all 7 in one way, shape, or form. They might see or manifest this disconnect, but we as instructors, as long as we put that on the assignment, honestly, we absolutely increase the likelihood. We do not guarantee it, but we increase the likelihood that they are going to engage in this, and that they are going to engage in this the way that we as the instructor is envisioning it. We want to make certain that the case study is captivating. And I like this word captivating, because oftentimes for those of us that use the case study approach, and in about 4 minutes or so, we're going to open this up to some discussion among us. But one thing that I love as the editor of many case study books is I love the titles of case studies. I think that just the titles of these, whether they have to do with organ donation, whether they have to do with leaving tips for wait staffs and the link between nonverbal communication and increase in gratuity, just seeing the word Jeffrey Dahmer, just seeing the word sexual, not a phrase, a word, but a phrase, sexual interest. They're like, done. I want to write about this. I'm interested. In 3 of my classes, I bring the case study books that first day and I say, what I want you guys to do in groups is I want you to choose the 3 case studies that you're going to be working on. What this does again is it gives them agency. Students like agency over their own education. If we give them a case study that we're interested in about structuration theory, it's still a theory that 14 years post-graduation, I still am not 100% sure I could explain. But structuration theory and a case study that's not linked to much about which our Gen Z students are able to link, they're not going to be interested. But if it's about Instagram, if it's about TikTok, if it's about things that they do, if it's about dating, they're hooked. And we know that the more they can relate to the material, the better they are going to do, the better connected they are going to be with the material. And ultimately, as that 18.8% said, the better they are going to be in terms of achieving program level outcomes, course level outcomes, and student learning outcomes, which is probably all going to be linked to institutional learning outcomes. It probably, if you listen to the last 30 seconds, you could probably make the claim that I have been very involved in assessment as of recent. Sorry if all of my assessment dialogue is manifesting itself. And then finally, I like to make the argument about from a pedagogical perspective, the 3 queries that we oftentimes are very interested in answering: the what now, and the so what. I think that the best educators are able to do all 3 of these. Explain the what, describe the what now, and dialogue about the so what. I think that what I have found is that most of us as instructors, because it's very difficult, have a lot of trouble extending beyond the what question. But I think what the incorporation of the case study allows us to do is to try to answer, and we're doing this collectively with the students, the what now and the so what, especially the so what. What are the implications? I love asking students, what are the implications? I just gave out a midterm exam just last night for my interpersonal communication class, and I'm not sure that there was one single short answer question where I did not say, and explain the implications of this. The Johari window, we have the open, we have the blind, we have the unknown, and we have the hidden. Okay, what are the implications of remaining in that blind window? How does this come to affect relationships, and how are relationships affected by this? Strategically, what are the metaphors that are linked to this? And it's one thing to be up in front of the class and dialoguing about this, but it's another thing to then read a case study about individuals, whether it's real or hypothetical, where they have been engaged in this, and to find the outcome and then retrospectively try to make sense of this by, again, incorporating the book and incorporating the notes about which you have learned in class. So I have been using the case study approach since I started teaching. I said to myself, you know what? I want to be the teacher in class that I would have liked to have had when I was an undergrad. And what would that teacher have been like? They would have been the teacher to incorporate something where it could extend beyond the learning in the classroom. And I really think that the case study approach is the one that really differentiates not only the effective instructor, from the ineffective or the less effective, but also the effective class, and most importantly, and we as instructors know this, most importantly, the effective and successful learner. So what I would love to do now is to kind of open this up to a little bit of a Q&A, and I know that Ryan, thank you. He had set up a little poll to see how many of us do incorporate the case study approach, but I would love to kind of engage in some collective dialogue here about, for those of us that have engaged in some case studies, maybe a little bit about best practices, maybe about things that haven't worked. I think that sometimes it's just as fruitful if we share some things that aren't very useful or don't really work in the classroom, and maybe just some questions and some comments that can kind of feed some dialogue here.
Great job, Corey. And please keep these questions coming. And I'm collating them and reading them aloud as we go here. 75% of the respondents in today's webinar do incorporate case studies in their teaching. So overwhelming majority, which is great.
Awesome. 75. All right, so that is, I can't do the stats offhand, and it looks like Tracy is here twice, so that would definitely screw up our data. But does anybody want to share of the 75? Oh, now Tracy's, now there's only one Tracy. All right, does anybody maybe want to share a particularly fruitful experience?
And while somebody's typing that in, are there any video case studies? Do you incorporate video case studies in your courses?
I do not, but I know that several of my colleagues do. And when I say colleagues, not at my home institution, but at large, there are a lot of video-based case studies. And this too goes back to the type of learner, the different types of learners, right? We have visual learners, we have auditory learners, and these auditory learners and visual learners are those that also need to see while listening, and they are then engaging with this just in a very different way. I'll give an example. Maybe this will start the conversation, but there is one case study that I use about grandparent-grandchild relationships. And it's just a phenomenal, and it was actually written by Howard Giles, and it's all about his communication accommodation theory. And it's just great. It's about how it is that grandparents are able in like 2021 to be able to negotiate the interactive guidelines and almost rules of how and when to dialogue with their grandchildren. Because if we think about 40 years ago versus now, it's a much different societal and communicative structure. And there are almost increased expectations that grandparents are more like the friend, quote unquote, as compared to 1950s and 1960s and 1970s society based on sociological research. What the case study argues is that oftentimes what grandparents do is they over accommodate, whereas grandchildren under accommodate. And for those of us that know about Giles's communication accommodation theory, when we got back to class to discuss this, 25 out of 25 of my students argued that 25 out of 25, not joking, 100% raised their hands and said, this is exactly what happens. Now, it might be just the nature of me being in New York City, that there's something that's part and parcel of this particular group of students. But it's phenomenal when a student can say, yeah, absolutely, I can totally relate to this. And the extent to which they can relate to it then makes the theory and the applicability come alive.
That's very helpful. This one, pretty much you've already answered it. So do you review concepts and theories in class? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I will say that I do not, it definitely depends, Svetlana. This was, I think, your question. It depends. And it also depends on who the author of the case study is. Most of the case studies that I use, and this is pretty much, I want to say that this is the norm rather than the exception for the case study books that are offered by Kendall Hunt. And Kendall Hunt, by the way, has an enormous casing list within the communication fields. They have a huge repertoire. And it is really the norm rather than the exception that a case study will not have a theoretical underpinning to it. So it's not just the case study, it's also here's the theory, here's the case, and then here is how and why the theory can help explain the case in question. So it's not always, Svetlana and everybody, that and this is just for anybody, and you guys might be able to share this information too. I don't always have time to go over the theory, but as long as the theory is somehow embedded in the case study, I ask them to somehow link. Again, the goal here is to link things together. If we were to create I know I'm going to sound like a mathematician, but if we were to create some sort of a Venn diagram here, really what we have is the class material. If we didn't have class material, there would be no point in paying for educators or coming to class. We then have the outside readings. We then have the case study. We then have own intuition. So we have 4 overlapping circles here. What I think is that as long as they have some way of connecting the class notes with hopefully the theory about which this case study applies with their own intuition, that's the goal. Right, the goal, let's assume that there is a case study that you are really interested in, but doesn't have a particular theory. One way of doing this is this case study doesn't have an overarching theory linked to it. Why don't you as a student create a theory? Why don't you create a theory that can help explain and describe what happened in this case? An organizational employee is very, very timid, about engaging in upward discourse in terms of upward descent, and really doesn't want to tell her boss that the way that he is handling things is really against the status quo. And decides, you know what, it's probably best to send an email. The only reason I'm giving this example is because one of my lines of research recently is about the extent to which the effectiveness of upward descent mirrors that which is given face-to-face if it's given via email or mediated formats. So let's assume that that's the case study. It's all about the role of mediated communication in communicating upward descent. But let's assume that we don't use a theory, that we use no organizational communication theory. We don't use network theory. We don't use from what I know structuration theory. What you could have your students do is you create your own theory that can help explain this. So I think that it's really a good idea to let the students know before anything is due to expect a theory to be embedded within the case study, but also not to be wary if there isn't one, and to feel free to create their own or to think just about how this is linked to any particular class content itself.
Personally, I love how you allow students to choose the case studies in the first class of the term. I think that's a brilliant idea to get their buy-in. Do you have recommendations for how to grade when using case studies?
It's a good question. And, you know, now that I am really knee deep in like middle states assessment, I realize that I am a very bad assessor in my own classes because I don't have rubrics. I think that the best way to assess these really has to do with A, did they understand the goal of the case study? And how you set up your own rubrics and how you operationally define understand is completely up to you. But did they understand in however long these are, and most of my case studies are about 5 pages in length, I will give them roughly 4 questions to answer. But did they understand the goal of this case study? The second rubric that I like to incorporate here is, were they able to effectively link the goal of the case study back to things about which we spoke in class? And this goes to one of the things that I mentioned that is a problem that is connected to one of the best practices, which is there's oftentimes a disconnect between what am I learning in the theory and what am I learning in class? And how does this manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself in the writing of the case study assignment. So we can tell rather quickly as an instructor the extent to which A, they read, and B, the extent to which they really understand why the instructor assigned this. And it does come down to the instructor, because if we don't ask the right questions of the students, it also puts them into a much more difficult position to provide the right answers, right? So this is kind of on us. And then the third thing that I make sure that happens is, again, the combination of these different materials, making sure that they are talking about things that they have learned in the class. For those of us that have outside readings, whether they are empirical in nature, whether they are textbook in nature, taking as much information as they can to make informed decisions. And the reason that I do this is I oftentimes say, let's think about what's going to happen post-graduation. Let's think about your postgraduate career. In my department, we have 5 majors. We have communication arts, we have strategic communication and public relations, we have digital journalism, we have film and media studies, and we have film and media production. And it doesn't matter what their major is. I say, let's assume that you graduate in a year and you are now part of a team, and that team is relying you on making a decision about budgeting, about a project, about a campaign. Think about the amount of resources that you are going to require and that they are going to require of you to make an informed decision, to come back to that team and say, I'm ready to what's the word I want to share with you? I am ready to present this to you as the best way that as a best practice, as the way that I think we ought to proceed. Well, what do they need? They need information from a myriad of different sources here. And I think that that's just the best metaphor. And if we link this back to how do we assess it? Again, I think we assess it. Did they understand the case study? Were they incorporating all 3 of these? Right? And most importantly, were they incorporating things that they were learning from class? Did they understand the practical utility? Do they understand why it is that I, the instructor, assigned this? And you can tell pretty quickly.
Do you have time for a couple more questions, Corey?
Absolutely.
Great. One of these is great. They're looking for recommendations for small group and persuasive communication cases. Any suggestions?
Yeah, for which one? I'm sorry?
Small group and persuasive communication.
Yes. So our group, and the one that I use, let's see. Give me a second. So we do, through Kendall Hunt, there is a casing persuasive communication. It is 27 case studies, and these case studies range in nature from there are 7 sections: interpersonal, group, organizational, mediated, political, health, and I'm missing one. but there are 7 parts, and it's just really, really good. And you as an individual can choose what these are. So I will just, nonverbal is the other. So I'll just read you one of the titles that I just turned to page 6. Chapter 18, and I had mentioned this earlier, Beyond Expectations, the Influence of Food servers' nonverbal behavior in service interactions. It's a great chapter about how it is that based on the nonverbal interaction between server and patron, there is an increased likelihood of a higher tip. And it has everything to do with the role of nonverbal persuasion. There is a great chapter in Persuasion and Small Group Communication about minority influence that happens in a jury. And these are not fictional accounts. These are things that actually have happened where the authors have done extensive research. Our group communication casebook, I think it might be, I apologize, it's in my home office, but I do my school office, but I do know that KH does have a group case study book. What I will do is I will make certain that I send everybody here the list of case books that is authored by KH. And again, their repository here is huge, and we keep editing, we keep updating the editions every single year. And it's really, it's great. I love writing them, but not only do I love writing them, but I love using them. For those of us that also write, there are so many things that I have written that I've never used in my classes and I've never looked at again. But when we write these case studies and then we use them in class and then we see the gratitude and gratification that students gain from the understanding, it really makes this profession worthwhile. So Ryan, I know, has a list of all participants from today and those who are going to be on the recording. So what I will do, or what Ryan will do, is send out an email list of all of the case books that are currently offered by and published by Kendall Hunt. And the reason I became involved in Kendall Hunt really was because I saw their first organizational communication casebook that was edited by my friend and colleague Jason Wrench at SUNY New Paltz, and I said, these are the case studies that I want to use. And it was just because they were short, they were explaining how we use case studies, why we use case studies, and it was just great.
This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
And thank you to everyone that's attended. As I had mentioned earlier, a webinar recording will be sent today or tomorrow or possibly Monday. And in addition to that, we'll include Corey's contact info on there as well. So if you have further questions for him or I, we can certainly get those answered.
Wonderful. And I thank everybody for attending. And I just put my email address into the chat. So please, this is the stuff I love to talk about. So send me an email, please. And I would love to talk and help out in any ways that I can.
Oh, one final question. Do you have any case studies on the history of chocolate through literature?
The history of that I do not. But it was a very interesting class. The guy was he was a graduate student and he was doing his thesis on chocolate through literature, and he decided to teach a class. And I'm like, oh my God, how easy is this going to be? Oh my Lord. It was the only thing that I understood or that I learned was that chocolate and cacao or cacao are not the same thing, and that I did not like real chocolate.
Well, thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.